Hi everyone, welcome to this CoastWA training on benefit distribution analysis. I'm Sarah Leck and I'll be taking you through these slides today. So what's the purpose of this training? Well, it's really to better understand benefit distribution analysis. So that includes why we do it, when we do it, and how we use it, as well as some of the challenges and key terminology and concepts that you might come across. We're also going to go through what information benefit distribution analysis does and does not provide and what it can be used for. And finally, we're going to look at how you can use it to inform funding and financing measures. So this first section that we're going to go through just provides a bit of a brief introduction to benefit distribution analysis. So what is benefit distribution analysis? Well, really all it's doing is telling you who is going to benefit from an investment. In this case, we're talking mostly about coastal adaptation investments. It also shows you how much those people will benefit, as well as when that benefit is going to occur and for how long the benefit might last. Further guidance on benefit distribution analysis is available in section 4.5.1 of the SPP 2.6 guidelines as well. Another important concept that we're going to cover today is the beneficiary pays principle. So the beneficiary pays principle is one form of cost recovery. You might come across other ones, including polluter pays, equal payment, or income-based. And the basic principle is that those who benefit from adaptation actions should pay for them. So for example, if you undertake a benefit distribution analysis and it shows that property owners receive 80% of the benefits of a seawall, those property owners under beneficiary pays principle would be required to pay 80% of the cost of that seawall. Again, further guidance on beneficiary pays principle can be found in 4.5 of the SPP 2.6 guidelines, as well as the CHAR map guidelines and the WA coastal zone strategy. So why do we use benefit distribution analysis? Well, as we said, it's about identifying which groups are receiving the most benefits from adaptation actions, as well as being able to identify the overall magnitude of benefits that are resulting from those adaptation actions. It's useful for ensuring that there is equitable cost recovery using the beneficiary pays principle, and it can be used then to inform funding and financing models for adaptation actions aligned with that beneficiary pays principle. When does it make sense to undertake benefit distribution analysis? Well, in the CHAR map guidelines is a requirement to consider benefit distribution analysis for funding and implementation during stage 6, but you can undertake a benefit distribution analysis before that stage if you want to. You can also undertake it after the CHAR map has been completed. You might want to update and reassess proposed funding mechanisms. New information might have come to light. The CHAR map process is a circular process. There will need to be updates over time, so that's pretty standard. So just thinking a bit more about why you might want to do a BDA at different stages. So at the end of stage 6, aligned with the CHAR map guidelines, you should have a preferred adaptation pathway clearly detailed. Doing the benefit distribution analysis at this stage allows you to then develop that financing and funding model based on the analysis for the really specific adaptation options. There is less flexibility then. You may have, missed an opportunity to get some community buy-in or understanding of who benefits or who may lose out from the projects at an earlier stage if you don't look at it until a later stage. So if you have the option to, you can start looking at it earlier. So if you're looking at it, for example, at the start of stage 5, you won't have specific adaptation options, but you can start to think about, well, who might benefit from different types of adaptation actions, who's going to be affected in different locations, and just get that better understanding of who may be affected by different options. Another consideration might be when you're doing a cost-benefit analysis. So cost-benefit analysis is similar to benefit distribution analysis, and so it can be efficient to do them at the same time when you're kind of doing the same analysis and valuation methods. So really the best approach can be to build it up, to think about doing a simple benefit distribution analysis in an early stage and then building up and doing a more complex specific one at a later stage. So this section is focused on planning and managing benefit distribution analysis. We'll go through the importance of confirming BDA objectives and scope. We'll also look at defining the base case and adaptation options, how you might identify outcomes, benefits, and beneficiaries, and also how you will identify appropriate information and some of the types of information you might need. Doing good benefit distribution analysis requires you to have a really clearly defined scope. Some of the elements of clear scope that you might want to consider are things like objectives. So what is it you're trying to achieve when undertaking the benefit distribution analysis? Do you want it to be used to inform a specific funding model that you're looking to implement? Is it at a much earlier stage? Is it the objective just to get an understanding of the range and type of beneficiaries of different coastal adaptation measures in your council area? Those different objectives will lead you to frame and scope up the project differently, so it's good to consider those early. Another one is location, where the analysis is focused. Is it on one specific beach, one suburb, across the whole LGA, for example? That decision will have implications for the type of information that you'll need, but also likely for the cost to undertake the BDA itself. Similarly, which hazards do you want to include? Is it just coastal erosion? Is it also flooding, inundation, other things? Again, including more hazards can increase the complexity and the time needed and the cost to complete the benefit distribution analysis, but also including more hazards can be useful because you're getting that more holistic understanding of what's happening. Similarly, which adaptation actions are you looking at for this benefit distribution analysis? Is it multiple different actions? Is it one specific action? What are the project outputs? So do you want, and this is closely aligned to the objective, do you want a specific funding model? Do you just want a report setting out what are the benefits and beneficiaries? So yeah, considering that is really important. And finally, who are the partners and stakeholders that you might want to or need to engage with throughout the project? Who should be included in setting up the project or developing the scope as well? Some important considerations when you're thinking about scope: stage of planning. So as we've talked about, depending where you are in your journey, you might be at an early stage, you might have some very loose adaptation actions that you want to consider. Your scope is going to be different from someone who has a really specific single adaptation action potentially that they want to develop a specific funding option for. Another important consideration is remit. So do you have, the scope to actually deliver these actions? Do you need to engage with others to get them over the line? What is within your remit specifically? What information and knowledge do you have available? So if there's good data and information, that's great, but often there might be some data and information lacking. So if you have a sense of what type of information that you have available, it will help you to inform your scope. Also budget and capacity. So as we talked about, the more adaptation actions you include, the more different locations you include, the more different hazards you include, the more complex the analysis is going to be and the more time consuming and costly. And then finally, your community values might also help you to set your scope. So considering looking at projects that you know are either particularly controversial or particularly valued by community can help you to really hone in on what's most important for your analysis. Another important consideration when undertaking benefit distribution analysis is understanding the base case and the project case. This is also true for cost-benefit analysis. So we really need to establish a clear base case scenario for any economic analysis that you're undertaking. The base case isn't necessarily do nothing. It's what you are already committed to doing, any investments or priorities, etc., that you already have funding for, that you've already agreed to. Doesn't include any new investments being proposed. So the key consideration is the difference between the base case scenario and the adaptation scenario that you're looking at through the benefit distribution analysis, not just the change from the present day. So tried to illustrate this with this graph here in the slide. So under the base case, this example is for beach width over time. Under the base case, the beach width may be declining very rapidly out to 2055. Your adaptation action is actually only slowing down the decline, not completely halting it. And so the important concept to consider is what is the difference between this grey line and this blue line, not what is the difference between the point we're at now in the 2020s and the point that you're at under the adaptation action plan in 2055. So it's just a really important consideration. This is something that if you have hired consultants to undertake the benefit distribution analysis for you, they should be able to guide you in how to do this. They should provide you with confidence that they can do this correctly, but they will need your support and input into what that base case looks like, what types of actions you will be undertaking that you're already committed to, and what that looks like in the future. Another key concept that we wanted to cover was identifying outcomes, benefits, and beneficiaries. So for any investment or adaptation action, you're going to have outcomes that will occur as a result of that action. Those outcomes are then what deliver the benefits, and the beneficiaries are then who receive those benefits. So just to go through an example, and this is a conceptual map which we would usually create for this type of analysis so that we can be really clear about what the outcomes that are expected are, who is going to benefit or who might face disbenefits or costs, and who that is affecting. And having a map like this can just really help to provide clarity on the conceptual links and the causal outcomes between these different elements. So in this example, your adaptation action might lead to outcomes such as protection of built assets. You might get a change in recreational use. You might get a change in beach and park area. So these are the types of outcomes that you'd be thinking about. Then what are the benefits of those outcomes? Well, the benefit from protecting your built assets is avoided damage costs. So, no erosion or damage to buildings, avoided disruption costs if you're avoiding flood impacts. For the recreational use, you might have recreational use benefits. So what are the benefits to people who are using the beach recreationally? There's also then potentially amenity, environmental benefits, existence benefits from the beach and the parkland existing. And then who are going to benefit from those outcomes? So if the avoided damage costs, maybe that's residents of private property, maybe it's commercial and industrial property. It's also ratepayers if you're protecting council-owned assets, maybe state government if you have some state roads that are being protected by the investment. Similarly, for the avoided disruption costs, maybe it's avoiding disruption to residents and commercial and industrial owners, potentially also tourists who might otherwise be coming. Similarly, for the recreational use benefits, maybe there's some residents and tourists who are the ones who are using the area recreationally. And then generally any kind of existence amenity benefits are for local residents. I'll just go through a bit of an example. This is from Queensland, but it is publicly available analysis, so I'm able to share it with you. This is looking at Noosa, Eastern Beaches in particular. This picture just shows the hazard lines for coastal erosion in the area. I think they're 2020, 2050, and 2070. And you can see that there's going to be large portions of beach and some parkland or native vegetation affected. There's also houses are starting to be affected. They're falling into these hazard areas, as are some kind of roads and beach access pathways. So how did we look at what the outcomes might be for these different coastal hazards? Well, this is just an example. So this is looking at different management actions undertaken and different options that they could look at. So option 1 is the base case with no action no further action occurring. Option 2 is dune management being undertaken, and then they also have ones such as seawall, and also another one where they purchase property and turn them into parks. So we really just break down the different types of areas affected by the outcomes. So you've got residential areas where under the base case with no action, you have assets being affected from 2070. if you put in any kind of dune management or seawall, you're actually delaying those assets being affected until after 2100. Similarly with the park area, assets going to be affected from 2070, but the actions allow those impacts to be delayed until after 2100. Got roads as well being affected here, other residential areas along other beaches. So this is how you might start to think about what the types of actions might be, when they're occurring is really important for benefit distribution analysis, and that change in the timing of those impacts based on the adaptation actions you're looking to undertake. And this table is just a bit of an example of some of the data that you might need to do the analysis. So number of households, number of people using the beach, reductions in recreational value as a result of the change in beach width, number of tourist days, tourist expenditure, value of the parklands, things like that. So this is the kind of detailed level of data that you need to do the analysis. There are also some common challenges that come up a lot with benefit distribution analysis. One of the key ones is understanding different benefits, costs, or disbenefits. So some adaptation actions can have disbenefits. So for example, if you build a seawall, it might provide benefits to property owners by protecting their properties, but you also may lose beach width in front of the seawall, and that may therefore be a cost to people who want to use the beach, or considered a disbenefit to those people. So it's really important to identify not just capital investment costs, but also other costs or trade-offs that might be happening as a result of these adaptation actions. It can also sometimes be challenging to identify specific beneficiaries. So again, thinking about the beach, do you actually know who's using the beach? Is it local residents? Is it people from further down the coast? Is it tourists, interstate, international? Getting really specific about who is using or benefiting from that asset can be challenging. It's also really important to understand what's going to happen in the future, and obviously that can be hard if you're thinking about future land use changes. That can make outcomes and benefits uncertain. So considering what's going to happen to population growth, are there going to be big new apartment buildings being built in this location? How many people are going to live there? When are they going to get built? Things like that is really important. Can also sometimes see benefits accidentally being included twice in the analysis. So a lot of benefit distribution analysis in the coastal adaptation space is going to rely on things like willingness to pay for recreational use. So that's thinking about what people would be willing to pay for access to the beach, for example. But within that, that's a very high level number, and that can include all of the considerations that person might put into what they'd be willing to pay. So things like their own personal health, mental health from access to the beach, physical health if they use it for running, pure existence benefits, enjoying the amenity of the beach, enjoying social connections and things like that. So you have to be careful if you're using values like that you don't then separately try and quantify things like health benefits from beach use. Finally, geographical boundaries for the analysis are really important. So if you do it at the LGA level, then anyone coming in from out of the LGA is classified as a tourist, for example, rather than a resident, whereas if you were doing it in the whole of the WA area, everyone in WA would be a resident and people coming from outside would be tourists. That has implications for which benefits you can and can't include and which values you can and can't include. We've flagged these here, but we should say that, again, if you're getting a consultant to do this analysis for you, they should be aware of all these challenges and they should raise them with you or be clear that they are addressing them appropriately in their analysis. We've talked a bit about information and data so far, but this is something that's really important for benefit distribution analysis. It's really reliant on data and information that's available. It is going to need to come from a range of different sources, likely from different parts within council, from potentially state government agencies or local community and other stakeholders. It's really useful if you actually try and identify some of the likely information requirements for BDA before you get started. Think about what existing information might be held by your organization or by other people that you might need. Try and identify any gaps and collect new information to fill those gaps where it makes sense. And if the information is not available, it's not to say that no analysis can be undertaken. It's just going to likely need to rely on assumptions. These might be informed by community or stakeholder engagement. There's other ways that this can be undertaken if that specific information isn't available, but you may also need to go away and gather further information in future. To give you a bit of an understanding of what information and data you might need, just included some examples here. You might need hazard information, that might be coastal and estuarine erosion and inundation mapping. You might need the timing and risk profile for those hazards, the extent that is affected, and the frequency of events as well is useful. You'll need some built asset locations and values, where are your public and private buildings located, where's your road network, are roads state or local that are going to be affected, other council built assets, car parks, toilet blocks, signs, and things like that. And then you'll need your financial value and maintenance costs for those preferably. Another one is beach, park, and recreational use data. This is often very important for benefit distribution analysis relating to coastal adaptation, but it's also often a big gap. So if you can get data like number of beach visitors, how many are from the local area, how many are visiting from outside, the number of people using your parks, other recreational facilities, and then also what might be the impact on those numbers as a result of flooding or erosion. So do you have any previous incidents that you could look at to tell you how people might respond if the beach gets damaged or destroyed? You're going to need your adaptation measures, so you need to understand what the impact of the proposed adaptation measures will be. So for example, protecting beach width, protecting beach access, frequency or risk of erosion or flood events and how they might change, and then the cost of those proposed adaptation measures. We also need environmental and heritage data if possible. Again, this is one that's often not a lot of good data on, but things like identifying the location of environmental assets and heritage assets and their values, and then also the changes in their value or use as a result of the coastal hazards. And then also, as we touched on previously, that kind of future information and planning data. So where are future buildings development's going to occur, any proposed planning controls, population growth rates, any changes in infrastructure access or use that are going to be happening. So this slide just provides a bit of a summary of planning and managing BDA that we've just gone through, and provides a bit of a checklist for you to consider. So first of all, you want to confirm your benefit distribution analysis objectives and scope. So you want to consider, have you identified a clear scope, including your objectives, location, hazards, adaptation actions, project outputs, partners, and stakeholders? Is the scope feasible and appropriate given the remit, information, and knowledge base, the current state of planning, the community values, and the resources you have? And you really want to do this before you engage a consultant. So yeah, you want to consider this as early as possible when setting up your BDA. The next consideration is identifying and defining those base case and adaptation options. So do you have a clear understanding of the base case? What investment is already occurring? What investment is already funded or in the planning stages? Which adaptation options do you want to include in the assessment? Are they clearly defined? Do you have costs and engineering designs completed? And if not, that's just a consideration that the analysis will be less detailed and might need to be refined again in future. The timing for this, again, you might want to consider developing this with the consultant, but thinking about and understanding it before you start the project will help set you up for success. Next, you want to make sure you're identifying the outcomes, benefits, and beneficiaries. Have you considered all of these key outcomes, benefits, and beneficiaries? Have you clearly identified the causal link between them all? This you will need to work closely with your consultant on, but you will need to provide them with a knowledge and understanding of the local area. You will have much more insight than them into what the outcomes and benefits might be. And finally, identifying information and data availability. So have you identified all the relevant information and data? And again, it's good if you can start to think about this prior to engaging consultants, but again, they can help you work through this process. This next section is focused on how we interpret BDA results, including understanding non-market valuation methodologies, how we use discounting, how we account for uncertainty in the analysis, and how we should go about reporting. This is just an example of some beneficiaries and benefits that we can think about to inform how we understand the results. So as an example, one of your key beneficiaries might be property owners from avoided loss of property due to coastal erosion, but also avoided loss of critical services such as property access, water, electricity. Another key beneficiary is often recreational users of the beach and surrounding parklands or natural areas. And the benefits to them are avoided loss of recreational benefits from using the beach and parkland. There's also local government ratepayers from avoided loss of council assets, state government if there are state government assets affected, so avoided loss of state government assets, and again commercial and industrial from avoided loss of capital and income as a result of coastal hazards. So this is just an example results table. So we've got all our different beneficiaries that we just saw. You'll get a total discounted benefit for each, most likely, and then you also will see a proportion of the total discounted benefits. So in this hypothetical example, your property owners have got $20 million in total discounted benefits, and that's 43% of the total discounted benefits, compared to, for example, state government, which has $2 million at 4%. Then the key question is, how do you get to those $20 million, $4 million, $2 million numbers? The key concept here is economic valuation. So for example, we might have some groins that are benefiting two groups. You have recreational users of a popular beach and you have property owners close to the beach. The analysis suggests that the groins would prevent the loss of 10,000 recreational visits to the beach each year and prevent the loss of 10 properties close to the beach as well. But how do we consistently compare these outcomes? The solution is monetization, which allows us to compare them in a like-for-like manner by using dollar values to consistently compare them. So going back to that example, we've got avoided loss of 10 properties, and we say that would lead to $8 million in benefits to property owners based on a hypothetical example of $800,000 average property price based on the market value of properties. Then to the avoided loss of 10,000 beach visits per year, we can estimate the value for each beach visit at $15 per visit based on previous studies being done, and that would give us a value of 7.5 million in benefits. So we can then directly compare the 8 million and the 7.5 million and identify which is bigger. So some of the valuation methods that you might come across in doing a benefit distribution analysis. So there are market-based valuation methods like I just mentioned. So we've got property prices is a market price that we can use. There's also some other things like health benefits, which are actually done using market-based valuation methods. So for example, avoided hospital visits, avoided costs associated with illness from loss of productivity or loss of working hours. More often, a lot of the coastal adaptation measures will need some kind of non-market valuation method because they're often associated with things like recreational use, environmental outcomes, heritage outcomes, which are not directly valued in markets. So some of the different methods you might see are real preference methods. So those are things like travel cost methods, which is where people estimate, or economists estimate, the value people are willing to place on something based on how much they spend traveling to it. So for example, if you travel 100 kilometers to go and spend a day in a national park, then you have spent X many dollars fueling up your car, spending the time in the car traveling, spending the time getting back. You can then estimate and say, well, we know that people place a greater value on the national park than that value that they spend getting there. So that's a travel cost method. Hedonic pricing is where we look at property prices for different areas. So you might have the same property, exactly the same size, number of rooms, other amenities for a property, but one is beachfront and one is not. And the difference in price between those two properties can give you an estimate of the value people place on access to the beach or view of the beach. Another common one then that you'll see are stated preference methods. So these are where we just go directly to people and ask them, what would you be willing to pay to go to the beach every day or once a week or whatever it might be. So these are a little bit less robust than some of the revealed preference methods, because obviously people struggle to really understand what that value might be. So, you might say, well, I'd be willing to spend $20 every month protecting sea turtles, but actually when you add up all the different, endangered species that you might want to protect, you actually would be paying a lot more than you could afford. It's actually, so that's a bit of a consideration there, but for councils is actually putting consideration of changes in rates into any survey like this can be really useful, so that people have that really clear understanding of what the actual cost would be. So you can ask, would you be willing to pay an extra $10 a quarter on your rates to protect the beach, and that gives them a real clear sense of what the actual cost would be. There are some other cost-based methods. So what would be the replacement cost if you had some damage from flooding? What would be the cost to replace everything? And that would then be the value of avoiding that flood. Mostly you'll see you won't be going out and doing new studies when you're doing your benefit distribution analysis. You'll mostly likely be using benefit transfer, which is when we look at existing studies and use the values in those to do analysis in a new location. There are some considerations such as adjusting for income, adjusting for changes in preferences over time that you might want to consider. But again, just kind of touching on these so that you get a sense of what they are, and so if these kind of terminology or jargon comes up, you know what's being talked about. If you've hired consultants to do this, they should be doing this for you, giving you some guidance on what values are appropriate and any limitations of any methods that might be used, any issues you might want to consider. There's also some further guidance on this in Appendix 5 of the CHAR-MAP guidelines. Another key concept that we wanted to cover is discounted versus undiscounted benefits. So in the results table, I talked about discounted dollars, and discounting is really important. It's used to account for the time value of money and enable us to compare costs and benefits at different points in time. So we use discounting because we generally recognize that a dollar received today is more valuable than a dollar received in the future. That's due to a range of factors like inflation, opportunity cost, risk, just internal preference for dollars today versus dollars tomorrow. Discounting can also help us account for intergenerational equity effects. So the general consideration there is that generations in the future will be better off than those now, and so we use discounting to account for that. Standard guidance across Australia used to be to use a 7% discount rate, although that rate can be varied depending on the circumstance, and you'll want to consider testing that through sensitivity analysis. Again, something that your consultants should talk to you about and discuss with you. And the chart just shows an example of what the effect of discounting is. So at a 7% rate, you go from if you had increasing benefits over time, reaching over $2 million in 2050, the application of the discount rate brings that right back down to less than $500,000 at that point in time. The other consideration is sensitivity analysis. I just mentioned it, talking about the discount rates, but benefit distribution analysis often depends on a lot of assumptions that are uncertain. As we've just gone through, your information on data might be limited, or you might be reliant on studies from other locations. So using sensitivity analysis can allow you to test how alternative assumptions affect your BDA results, and just have more confidence in which of those assumptions are really driving the findings. This is just an example table of what a sensitivity analysis might look like. So you're varying different factors and seeing how it affects the beneficiaries and the total benefits. It also can identify opportunities for future work. So if you find that there's an assumption that you're really uncertain about, but really strongly affects the results, then that's an area that you want to focus on getting better data and information on. For the final part of this section, we wanted to cover reporting of results. This is really important, particularly for then communicating the findings to other audiences, to decision makers in council or in future to community. To do that, you need to make sure that your reporting is clear, concise, easily understood by a non-technical audience, so avoiding jargon and things like that. You want to make sure that there's been an executive summary included for decision makers, and you want to include technical appendices with details about methodologies and assumptions so that the analysis can be repeated in future if needed, and people can be clear on what's been done. So again, we've just got a final checklist for that reporting element. You want to make sure that you've documented your methods and data used, have your values that you've used been clearly documented, methods explained, have you included any assumptions or data limitations, has the discount rate been clearly documented, have you done sensitivity analysis for all key assumptions, did it change any of the key findings, and if the assumption is material and uncertain, then you want to identify this as a clear area for future research or analysis. And then finally, does the content and structure of the report fit the intended audience and purpose? Is it clear, concise, and easily understood by a non-technical audience? Did you include the executive summary, and does it include technical appendices? So again, this is really just considerations that you might want to go through with your consultant, make sure that they are including all of these things in any reporting and analysis that they're providing back to you. The final section that we're going to go through today is applying benefit distribution analysis results to planning decisions. So we'll go into a bit more detail about the beneficiary pays principle and some other principles that you might want to consider, go through an example application, and discuss again how you might want to build this knowledge over time. As a bit of a recap, the beneficiary pays principle, it focuses on equity. Those who benefit from an investment should pay for it. It's really the key purpose of benefit distribution analysis, to identify those beneficiaries and to understand appropriate funding for action. However, the beneficiary pays principle by itself doesn't consider things like ability to pay, boundary issues, perverse incentives or unintended consequences, or administrative costs. So there are some other principles that you might want to consider when developing funding mechanisms. So as well as equity, the beneficiary pays principle, we might want to also consider simplicity. So you want the funding mechanism to be relatively simple, to reduce administrative burden and to reduce transaction costs, and to make sure as well that the approach is robust to future changes in hazards. So the more complex you make it, the more likely it is to no longer be appropriate if things change. You also want to consider efficiency, so the funding mechanism should be efficient and not cause distortions or perverse incentives, such as leading to changing behaviour to avoid paying. You also want to consider transparency, so making sure that the split of funding is transparent and easily communicated to those who are paying for the adaptation measures. And finally, adequacy, so you want to make sure that the funding mechanism is actually going to raise sufficient funds for the required adaptation measures, and that you're going to get the same funding amount in each year if you're raising the money annually. So just as a bit of an example, if we do a benefit distribution analysis and we show that for a program of beach nourishment and dune building, 50% of the benefits are being received by property owners along the beachfront, 10% of the benefits are being received by the state from avoided damage to a state road, 30% of the benefits are received by people using the beach, which is a mix of local residents and visitors, and 10% of the benefits are received by the local government from avoided damage to council-owned assets. Under a beneficiary pays principle approach, each beneficiary would contribute a proportion of the funding based on the proportion of benefits they receive. Now that might be relatively straightforward for both the property owners and even for the state government to raise that money from those people, but how do you charge the beach users? So are you going to do a parking charge for accessing the beach, for example? That obviously might have quite high transaction costs for the council, putting in parking meters or putting in cameras. There may end up being significant perverse incentives. People may park a few streets over and just walk. You may get people going to other different beaches nearby. So in that case, it might be that if most of the beach users are locals, you just consider doing a flat charge on all ratepayers to recover those costs. And again, just to reiterate that none of this stuff is simple and done once. You're going to probably need to update your benefit distribution analysis over time. You might need to refine it. You might have identified your preferred adaptation options, your benefits and your beneficiaries. You then engage with community and key stakeholders and get some feedback. You need to update your information and refine your options for adaptation and funding at that stage, and you might need to redo your BDA based on new options or proposed funding models. And just some key takeaways. Benefit distribution analysis is useful for forming decisions on funding models for adaptation measures. There's a bunch of standard economic analysis techniques that can be used for BDA. We've covered some of the common issues and terminology here, and they are also provided in the accompanying fact sheets. There are some challenges in implementing BDA. It's not always going to produce simple answers for funding, but it can provide you with a lot of useful insights. You want to make sure there's a focus on transparency and transparent analysis that draws on as much local information and knowledge as possible to complete the assessment. You want to be clear about identifying key trade-offs and challenges that can help prepare for the need to communicate and engage with stakeholders and community at a later date. Also, identifying those key stakeholders and information owners early and bringing them on the journey is really important. And finally, you want to ensure that the benefits of action are clearly communicated and can be easily understood by community and decision makers so that you can implement adaptation actions